The air in the hospital was heavy with the usual blend of antiseptic and exhaustion, but on this particular evening, there was something different, a faint, peculiar smell that seemed to follow Nurse Lisa wherever she went. At first, she dismissed it as part of the usual chaos in the ER. Maybe it was a spilled cleaning solution or something brought in from outside. But as the shift wore on, the scent lingered, faint but persistent, a sour, almost chemical tang that made her stomach twist. Lisa was no stranger to strange happenings in the hospital. After 10 years on the job, she'd seen her share of bizarre cases and frantic late-night emergencies. But this smell unsettled her in a way she couldn't explain. It wasn't just the smell, though. Something else was gnawing at her instincts, the same instincts that had saved lives more than once. She shook it off, telling herself she was just tired. Her shift was winding down when she noticed a patient sitting quietly in the waiting area. The woman was in her mid-30s, her dark skin radiant under the fluorescent lights, but her expression was tense, almost guarded. She was dressed in an oversized hoodie and jeans, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked unwell, though not in the usual way. There was no visible injury, no signs of immediate distress, but something was off. Lisa couldn't quite put her finger on it. It wasn't until the woman shifted in her seat that Lisa saw it, a faint yellow stain along the hem of her hoodie. Her eyes narrowed as she stepped closer, her nursing instincts kicking in. "Hi, I'm Lisa," she said gently, crouching to meet the woman's gaze. "Are you here to see a doctor?" The woman hesitated, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. Finally, she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't feel good. Can you tell me what's wrong?" Lisa asked, her tone soft but steady. The woman looked down at her hands, her fingers trembling. "I've been feeling sick for a few days. Weak. Dizzy. I thought it would pass, but," she trailed off, her voice cracking with exhaustion. Lisa's eyes flicked back to the yellow stain. Something about it seemed unnatural. She reached out, her hand stopping just short of touching the fabric. "Do you mind if I take a closer look?" The woman hesitated again, then nodded. Lisa gently lifted the edge of the hoodie, revealing more of the strange yellow marks, now streaked across the woman's skin. The stains weren't just on her clothes, they were seeping from her pores. A chill ran down Lisa's spine as her mind raced to make sense of what she was seeing. "Have you been exposed to anything unusual lately? Chemicals? A new medication?" Lisa asked, keeping her voice calm even as her pulse quickened. The woman shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "No. I don't know what this is. It just started a couple of days ago." Lisa forced a reassuring smile, but her thoughts were anything but calm. This wasn't normal, not by a long shot. The smell, the stains, the woman's symptoms, they didn't add up to any medical condition Lisa had ever encountered. "I'm going to get a doctor to check on you, okay? Just sit tight." Lisa rose to her feet, her mind racing as she headed toward the nurse's station. She tried to convince herself it was nothing, maybe an allergic reaction or a rare skin condition. But deep down, she knew better. As she picked up the phone to call for a physician, the strange smell seemed to intensify, almost as if it were clinging to her now. A sense of unease settled over her, heavy and suffocating. Before she could dial, she glanced back toward the waiting area. The woman was staring straight at her, her eyes pleading, her lips moving silently. Lisa felt a lump rise in her throat. She didn't know what was wrong with this woman, but something told her it was far more serious than a simple medical anomaly. Her finger hovered over the keys, but instead of calling a doctor, she dialed 911. "Emergency services, what's your emergency?" The operator's voice crackled through the line. Lisa hesitated, her voice shaking as she finally spoke. I'm a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital. There's a patient here. Something's very wrong. Please send someone right away." As the operator assured her help was on the way, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just opened the door to something far darker than she could have imagined. Lisa returned to the waiting area, her face calm, though her heart hammered in her chest. The woman was still seated, though her posture had stiffened, and her hands gripped the armrests as if she were holding herself together by sheer force of will. The smell was stronger now, and Lisa could feel it clinging to her like an invisible fog, unsettling and sharp. "I've called for someone to help," Lisa said gently, taking a seat across from the woman. "They'll be here soon." The woman gave a faint nod, her lips pressed tightly together. For a moment, there was silence between them, save for the distant hum of hospital machines and the occasional murmur of voices from down the hall. Lisa's gaze drifted again to the yellow stains, now clearly visible against the woman's dark skin. They had an almost oily sheen, and their presence felt wrong, like something that didn't belong to this world. Her training told her to stay objective, to think clinically, but her instincts whispered that this wasn't something she could explain with textbooks or science. "What's your name?" Lisa asked, trying to keep the woman engaged. "Monica," the woman replied, her voice barely audible. "Monica, have you been anywhere unusual lately? A new job, maybe? Or traveled somewhere different?" Monica shook her head, her eyes darting to the door as though she was willing the emergency responders to arrive faster. "I work at a daycare," she said softly. "Haven't been anywhere else. Just home and work." Lisa frowned, her mind running through possibilities. An environmental exposure? An infection? But none of it lined up. The smell, the stains, Monica's symptoms, they were too bizarre, too unnatural. Suddenly, Monica winced, clutching her stomach. A low, pained moan escaped her lips, and she doubled over, nearly slipping from the chair. Lisa rushed to her side, steadying her. "What's wrong? Is it your stomach? Your chest?" Monica didn't answer right away. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her body trembling. Then, she looked up, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. "It's spreading," she whispered. Lisa froze. "What's spreading?" Monica opened her hoodie slightly, revealing more yellow stains creeping up her torso, like veins of a dark, sickly liquid crawling beneath her skin. Lisa's breath hitched as she leaned in, trying to assess what was happening without letting her own fear show. The stains didn't just look like something seeping from her pores, they seemed alive, pulsating faintly, as if they were moving of their own accord. "I can feel it," Monica said, her voice breaking. "It's inside me." Lisa's mind raced. This wasn't a medical emergency, it was something far more sinister. She thought of the 911 call and silently prayed that help would arrive soon. Before she could respond, a loud crash echoed from the hallway, startling both of them. Lisa shot to her feet, her heart pounding. She looked toward the noise but saw nothing, just the empty corridor stretching out like a dark, gaping maw. "Stay here," Lisa said, though her own voice wavered. Monica grabbed her wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. "Don't leave me!" Lisa hesitated, torn between staying with Monica and investigating the sound. Then, as if to make the decision for her, the smell intensified again, filling the air like a suffocating cloud. She could taste it now, bitter and acrid, coating her throat. "Okay," she said quickly, kneeling beside Monica. "We'll wait here together. Help is on the way." But as she spoke, another noise filled the air, a low, guttural groan that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It wasn't Monica, it wasn't anything human. Lisa's blood ran cold. Something was very, very wrong, and whatever it wasn't just inside Monica. It was here, in the hospital, and it was getting closer. She reached for her phone, her hands trembling, and dialed 911 again. This time, her voice was barely steady as she spoke. "This is Nurse Lisa at St. Mary's. We need immediate assistance. She paused, unsure of how to explain. "It's an emergency. Please hurry." As she ended the call, she turned back to Monica, who was staring at her with a haunted expression. "They're coming," Lisa assured her, though she wasn't sure who she was trying to convince. Monica didn't respond. Her gaze shifted past Lisa, toward the corridor. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Lisa followed her line of sight, and for a brief, chilling moment, she thought she saw something move in the shadows. Something large. Something that shouldn't be there. The faint sound of sirens reached her ears, a distant promise of help. But deep down, Lisa knew that whatever was coming might arrive too late. Lisa's fingers tightened around her phone, her breath catching as the distant sirens grew louder. She glanced back at Monica, who was still fixated on the darkened corridor. The woman's face was pale, her lips trembling as if she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Lisa followed her gaze again, half expecting to see something emerge from the shadows. But the hallway remained eerily still, the fluorescent lights flickering faintly. The tension in the room was suffocating, thick like a storm cloud about to break. Lisa tried to focus on her training, on staying calm and present, but her mind kept returning to the unexplainable, the stains, the smell, and that unshakable feeling that something unseen was lurking nearby. "Monica," Lisa said softly, crouching beside her again. "I need you to tell me everything. When did this start? Did anything unusual happen before you felt sick?" Monica's breathing was shallow, her chest rising and falling in uneven spurts. For a moment, Lisa thought she might not answer, but then Monica swallowed hard and whispered, "It was a few days ago. At work. One of the kids," her voice trailed off, her eyes glistening with tears. "What about one of the kids?" Lisa prompted gently. Monica blinked, the tears spilling over. He got sick. Really sick. It happened so fast. One minute he was playing, and the next he was burning up, shaking. We called an ambulance, but by the time they got there, she choked on the words, pressing her hands to her face. Lisa's stomach turned. Did the doctors figure out what was wrong with him? Monica shook her head, her hands falling limply to her lap. No. They said it was a fever, maybe an infection, but they didn't know for sure. The other kids seemed fine at first, but then, she hesitated, her voice dropping to a whisper. Then I started feeling sick too. Lisa tried to piece the information together, her mind spinning. An illness spreading through the daycare? It wasn't unheard of, kids carried germs all the time. But this didn't sound like any illness she'd ever encountered. And then there was the smell. The stains. Did you touch anything unusual? Maybe something the sick child had with him? Lisa asked, her voice steady despite the growing unease in her chest. Monica frowned, as if trying to recall. I don't think so. Just his backpack. I grabbed it to give to the paramedics. But it was sticky. Like something had spilled inside. A cold shiver ran down Lisa's spine. Sticky? She couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened at that daycare was the key to understanding what was happening to Monica now. Before Lisa could ask more, Monica winced again, doubling over as another wave of pain racked her body. Lisa reached for her shoulder, steadying her as she gasped for air. Stay with me, Monica, Lisa urged. Help is almost here. But Monica's body was trembling now, her eyes wide with panic. It's inside me, she whimpered, clutching her stomach. I can feel it moving. Lisa's pulse quickened as she glanced toward the hallway, willing the paramedics to arrive faster. The sirens were closed now, but they still felt too far away. Suddenly, a faint rustling sound broke the silence, coming from the direction of the corridor. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but it sent a chill down Lisa's spine. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the shadows. There was nothing there. At least, that's what she told herself. But the rustling came again, louder this time, and she could no longer ignore the sense that something was watching them. Is someone there? Lisa called out, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to stay calm. No answer. Just the faint hum of the hospital lights and the distant wail of sirens. Lisa's grip on her phone tightened as she stepped toward the edge of the waiting area, peering into the hallway. She could feel Monica's eyes on her, could sense the fear radiating from the woman behind her. And then she saw it. At first, it was just a flicker of movement, something darting out of sight at the edge of her vision. Lisa's breath hitched as she stared into the shadows, her heart pounding in her chest. Hello, she called again, her voice firmer this time. Still no response. But as she took a cautious step closer, the smell hit her again, stronger now, almost overpowering. It was the same acrid, chemical scent that had clung to Monica, but it was heavier here, more concentrated. Lisa forced herself to take another step, her instinct screaming at her to turn back. She reached for the light switch on the wall, her fingers brushing against the cold plastic. But before she could flip it, a loud bang echoed through the corridor, followed by the sound of something heavy skittering across the floor. Lisa froze, her heart racing as she tried to make sense of the sound. It didn't make sense, none of this made sense. Behind her, Monica let out a soft, terrified moan. "Don't leave me," she whispered, her voice breaking. Lisa turned back, her resolve hardening. Whatever was happening, she couldn't leave Monica alone. She moved quickly to the woman's side, kneeling beside her again. "It's going to be okay," Lisa said, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. "The paramedics are almost here. Just hold on." Monica didn't respond. She was trembling now, her skin slick with sweat. Lisa placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to offer some semblance of comfort, but the moment her fingers touched Monica's skin, she recoiled in shock. It was hot. Not just warm, but burning, like touching a stove. Lisa pulled her hand back, staring at Monica in alarm. "Monica, you're burning up. We need to get you cooled down." But Monica didn't seem to hear her. She was staring straight ahead, her eyes wide with a mix of terror and resignation. "It's too late," she whispered. Before Lisa could respond, the sirens outside stopped, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed through the hospital entrance. Relief flooded through her as she realized the paramedics had arrived. But as she turned toward the sound, ready to wave them down, a new noise filled the air, a low, guttural growl that sent chills racing down her spine. It was coming from the corridor. Lisa froze, her eyes locking with Monica's. The woman's lips moved, forming a single word that sent a fresh wave of fear coursing through Lisa's veins. "Run." Lisa couldn't move. Her body felt paralyzed as the weight of Monica's whispered warning hung in the air. The low growl resonated again, this time louder, closer, reverberating through the corridor like a predator announcing its presence. Lisa's rational mind fought against the primal fear clawing at her chest. This was a hospital, a place of order and safety. There was no room here for monsters. But the sound didn't lie. Monica's trembling hand gripped Lisa's wrist, snapping her out of her daze. "Please," Monica begged, her voice weak but desperate. "Get away before it takes you too." Lisa shook her head, her instincts as a nurse overpowering her fear. She couldn't abandon Monica, not when she was clearly fighting for her life. "I'm not leaving you," Lisa said firmly, though her voice wavered. "Help is here. We just need to get through this." The footsteps from the paramedics grew louder, their voices echoing faintly from the hospital's main entrance. Relief flickered in Lisa's chest, but it was quickly extinguished as the growl morphed into a guttural hiss. It was unnatural, otherworldly, a sound that didn't belong to anything she could comprehend. And then she saw it. It moved at the edge of the light, just beyond clear view. A shifting shadow, dark and fluid, like smoke given form. It clung to the corners of the corridor, its shape undulating in a way that made Lisa's stomach churn. Whatever it wasn't human. Lisa instinctively placed herself between Monica and the corridor, her body stiff with fear. "Stay behind me," she whispered, though she had no idea what she could possibly do to protect either of them. The shadow seemed to pause, as if it were watching, calculating. The acrid smell intensified, filling the air so thickly that Lisa had to fight the urge to gag. She reached for her phone again, her fingers trembling as she fumbled to dial the emergency line once more. The voice of the operator crackled through the line. 911, what's your emergency?" Lisa's voice shook as she spoke, her eyes never leaving the shifting darkness. "This is Nurse Lisa at St. Mary's Hospital. We're in the ER waiting area. Something's here. Please, we need help now." The operator's voice remained calm, professional. "Ma'am, emergency responders are on site. Can you describe the situation?" Lisa opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat as the shadow began to move again. This time, it crept closer, its shape elongating, stretching toward them like a living nightmare. She dropped the phone, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The operator's voice faded into the background as the shadow loomed larger, its presence suffocating. "Lisa," Monica croaked, her voice weak but urgent. "Don't let it touch you." Lisa glanced back at Monica, her fear momentarily replaced by confusion. "What is it?" she whispered. Monica's face was pale, her eyes glazed with a mix of pain and terror. "It's what's inside me," she said, her words barely audible. "It's trying to spread." Lisa's mind reeled. The stains, the smell, the pulsating marks on Monica's skin, it was all connected to this thing, this shadow that now seemed to hunger for more. The paramedics' voices grew louder as they entered the hallway, their footsteps echoing through the sterile space. "Hello? Is anyone here?" one of them called out, their tone cautious. Lisa turned toward the sound, relief flooding her chest. "We're here," she called back, her voice cracking. But as the paramedics rounded the corner, the shadow surged forward, faster than Lisa thought possible. It moved like liquid, slithering across the floor and up the walls, consuming the light as it advanced. "Get back!" Lisa screamed, but it was too late. The shadow struck with horrifying precision, enveloping one of the paramedics in an instant. His scream was cut short as the darkness consumed him, his body vanishing into its inky depths. The other paramedic froze, his eyes wide with terror as he stumbled backward. "What the hell is that?" he shouted, his voice high-pitched with panic. Lisa grabbed Monica, pulling her to her feet despite the woman's weakened state. "We have to move," she shouted, her fear driving her forward. The remaining paramedic hesitated for a moment longer before turning to run, his footsteps pounding against the tiled floor. Lisa dragged Monica toward the opposite end of the hallway, her heart racing as the shadow pursued them. Every instinct screamed at her to abandon Monica, to save herself, but she couldn't bring herself to let go. The woman's life was slipping away before her eyes, and Lisa couldn't bear the thought of leaving her to face this nightmare alone. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly before them, the flickering lights casting eerie shadows on the walls. The smell was unbearable now, choking Lisa with every breath, but she forced herself to keep moving. Behind them, the shadow roared, a sound so deep and guttural that it rattled her bones. Lisa risked a glance over her shoulder and immediately regretted it. The shadow was larger now, darker, its edges writhing like tendrils reaching for them. Monica stumbled, nearly falling to the ground. Lisa tightened her grip, pulling her upright. "Stay with me," she shouted, her voice raw with desperation. "I can't," Monica gasped, her body sagging against Lisa. "It's too late for me." "No!" Lisa snapped, her determination flaring. "I'm not leaving you." But as the shadow surged closer, its tendrils reaching out to brush against the walls, Lisa knew they were running out of time. She had to find a way to stop it, to protect Monica and herself, before it was too late. The exit was just ahead, the doors leading to the ambulance bay visible through the haze of fear clouding Lisa's vision. She pushed forward, dragging Monica with her, each step feeling like a battle against the weight of the growing darkness. But as they neared the doors, a chilling realization hit Lisa like a punch to the gut. The shadow wasn't just chasing them, it was spreading, its tendrils snaking along the walls and floor, infecting everything it touched. And it wasn't going to stop. Lisa gritted her teeth, her lungs burning with effort as she dragged Monica closer to the exit. The shadow was relentless, its tendrils spreading like ink in water, darkening everything it touched. Each step felt heavier, like the air itself was turning against them. She glanced over her shoulder, catching a glimpse of the remaining paramedic frozen in terror, his back pressed against the wall. He looked at her, his face pale and drenched in sweat, mouthing words she couldn't hear. Monica whimpered, her legs buckling. Lisa tightened her grip, practically carrying her now. "You have to fight, Monica," Lisa urged, her voice trembling. "We're almost there. Just hold on a little longer." But Monica shook her head weakly, her eyes brimming with despair. "It's inside me, Lisa," she whispered again. "You can't save me. You have to save yourself." Lisa refused to accept it. She didn't come this far to give up now. As they stumbled closer to the exit, a loud crash echoed through the hallway. Lisa turned in time to see the paramedic attempting to fight back, wielding a metal chair he'd grabbed from the waiting area. He swung it at the shadow, but it passed through as if striking nothing but air. The shadow retaliated, lunging forward and enveloping him in one swift motion. His screams cut through the air, raw and desperate, before being silenced entirely. Lisa's heart pounded as she turned back to the exit. Her fingers clawed at the push bar on the door, shoving it open with all her strength. The cool night air hit her face, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat inside. She dragged Monica through the doorway, collapsing onto the asphalt of the ambulance bay. Outside, the world seemed momentarily normal. The paramedics' vehicle was parked nearby, its lights flashing in rhythmic patterns. The sound of distant traffic hummed faintly in the background, a reminder of the world beyond this nightmare. But Lisa knew they weren't safe yet. The shadow didn't stop at the threshold. It seeped through the open door, its tendrils curling around the frame like a predator stalking its prey. Lisa scrambled to her feet, her hands gripping Monica's arms as she tried to pull her further away. "Help!" Lisa shouted, her voice cracking with desperation. "Somebody, please!" But the bay was eerily empty, the second ambulance crew nowhere to be seen. Lisa's mind raced. Had the shadow already reached them? Were they gone too? Monica coughed violently, doubling over as a fresh wave of pain overtook her. Lisa knelt beside her, torn between her instinct to flee and her duty to protect. Monica's skin was burning hotter now, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. Lisa noticed something new, a faint, yellowish glow beneath the surface of Monica's skin, like veins of light pulsing in time with her heartbeat. "What's happening to you?" Lisa whispered, horrified. Monica's eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. "It's spreading," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "It's not just me. It's everywhere now." Lisa's gaze snapped back to the shadow, which had grown larger, darker, more defined. It loomed just a few feet away, its tendrils snaking toward them with deliberate intent. Lisa grabbed Monica, pulling her up despite her protests. "We can't stay here," she said firmly. "We have to move." The nearest ambulance was just a few steps away. Lisa dragged Monica toward it, her mind scrambling for a plan. If she could get them inside, maybe they could barricade themselves long enough to figure out what to do next. She reached the vehicle, yanking open the back doors and helping Monica inside. The second she slammed the doors shut, the shadow struck, slamming against the ambulance like a tidal wave. The vehicle rocked under the force, the windows darkening as the shadow enveloped it. Lisa pressed her back against the doors, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. Monica lay on the gurney, her body convulsing as the glowing veins beneath her skin grew brighter. Lisa fumbled for the medical kit strapped to the wall, her hands shaking as she searched for anything that might help. She grabbed a syringe of epinephrine, her mind racing. It wasn't meant for this, but she had to try something. "I'm sorry," Lisa whispered as she injected the needle into Monica's arm. Monica gasped, her body jerking violently before collapsing back onto the gurney. For a moment, Lisa thought she'd made a terrible mistake. But then Monica's breathing steadied, the convulsions stopping. "It's working," Lisa murmured, hope flickering in her chest. But the moment was short-lived. The shadow outside shifted, its tendrils pressing harder against the ambulance, the metal groaning under the strain. And then Lisa realized something chilling, it wasn't just outside anymore. The acrid smell was back, stronger than ever, and with it came a faint, pulsing darkness seeping through the seams of the doors. The shadow was inside. Lisa's eyes darted around the cramped space, her mind racing. She grabbed a flashlight from the kit, flicking it on and aiming it at the encroaching darkness. To her shock, the light seemed to hold it back, the tendrils recoiling slightly. "It doesn't like the light," she muttered, her grip on the flashlight tightening. She turned the beam toward Monica, who was stirring now, her eyes fluttering open. The glow beneath her skin had dimmed slightly, but it was still there, pulsing faintly. "Lisa," Monica whispered, her voice hoarse. "You can't fight it. You have to warn them." "Warn who?" Lisa asked, her voice urgent. Monica's gaze locked onto hers, her expression filled with both terror and resignation. "Everyone." Lisa's heart sank at Monica's words, but there was no time to fully process their weight. The shadow pressed harder against the ambulance, the metal walls groaning under the strain as faint tendrils of darkness seeped in through every crack. Lisa tightened her grip on the flashlight, its beam a fragile shield against the encroaching nightmare. Monica tried to sit up but collapsed back onto the gurney, her strength fading fast. The faint glow beneath her skin pulsed rhythmically, dimming and brightening like a heartbeat. Lisa's stomach churned at the sight, a nauseating mix of fear and helplessness. "Monica, what do you mean warn them?" Lisa asked, her voice rising in urgency. "Who? What is this thing?" Monica's lips parted, but her words were faint, barely audible over the relentless sound of the shadow scraping against the ambulance. "It's older than us. Older than anything. It takes and spreads, always looking for more." Lisa shook her head, frustration bubbling up. "That doesn't make any sense. What does it want from you?" "From us." Monica's gaze flickered to the beam of light in Lisa's hand, her eyes momentarily sharp with clarity. "It doesn't just want me. It wants everything. The more it touches, the stronger it becomes. If it gets out," her voice faltered, her breathing shallow. "You can't let it out, Lisa." The weight of her words settled like a stone in Lisa's chest. The shadow wasn't just a threat to them, it was a threat to everyone. She gritted her teeth, her mind racing for a solution. The flashlight was holding it back for now, but it wouldn't last forever. She needed a way to stop it completely, to destroy it before it consumed everything in its path. The ambulance suddenly lurched, the shadow's tendrils wrapping around the tires and lifting it slightly off the ground. Lisa stumbled, barely catching herself against the wall. Monica cried out weakly, clutching her side as the vehicle groaned under the pressure. "Hang on!" Lisa shouted, though she had no idea what she could do. Her eyes darted around the small space, searching for anything that might help. Her gaze landed on the control panel for the ambulance's lights and sirens. A desperate idea formed in her mind. She lunged forward, slamming her palm against the panel. The ambulance's emergency lights began to flash, casting the interior in rapid bursts of red and white. The sirens blared to life, their high-pitched wail echoing through the night. The effect was immediate. The shadow recoiled, its tendrils pulling back slightly as the flashing lights sliced through the darkness. Lisa felt a surge of hope, but it was short-lived. The shadow seemed to adapt, its movements growing more erratic as it tried to find a way around the light. Monica groaned, her body convulsing slightly as the glow beneath her skin grew brighter again. Lisa rushed to her side, gripping her hand tightly. "Stay with me, Monica," she pleaded. "I'm going to get us out of this." Monica's eyes fluttered open, her expression pained but determined. "You have to end it," she whispered. "It won't stop unless you end it." Lisa nodded, though her mind was still grasping for a plan. She glanced out the small window in the ambulance's back doors. The shadow had spread across the entire parking lot, its tendrils creeping toward the hospital's main entrance. Panic surged through her veins. If it got inside, there would be no stopping it. Her gaze shifted to the paramedics' equipment stored in the corner. Among the supplies, she spotted a small tank of compressed oxygen and a box of emergency flares. The pieces clicked together in her mind, forming a reckless but potentially life-saving plan. "Monica, hold on," Lisa said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. She grabbed the oxygen tank and one of the flares, her hands trembling as she worked. If she could create a controlled explosion, it might be enough to drive the shadow back, or at least buy them time to escape. The shadow began pressing against the ambulance again, its tendrils more aggressive than before. Lisa lit the flare, its bright red glow casting eerie shadows across the cramped space. The heat was intense, but it didn't faze her. She positioned the oxygen tank near the doors, aiming the flare toward it. "Lisa, no," Monica croaked, her voice weak but urgent. "I have to try," Lisa said, her voice firm. "It's the only way." She took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the flare. The shadow surged forward, its tendrils smashing through the seams of the ambulance, reaching for her. Lisa didn't hesitate. She slammed the flare against the tank, bracing herself for the explosion. A blinding flash of light filled the ambulance, followed by a deafening roar. The force of the blast threw Lisa backward, slamming her against the wall. Pain shot through her body, but she didn't have time to register it. The doors of the ambulance flew open, and the shadow screamed, a sound so otherworldly that it made her ears ring. When the light faded, Lisa blinked against the darkness, her vision swimming. The shadow had retreated slightly, its tendrils writhing as if in pain. But it wasn't gone. It was still there, lurking, waiting. Monica's weak voice cut through the chaos. "It's not enough," she murmured. "You have to finish it." Lisa's heart sank. The explosion had only bought them a little time. She needed something stronger, something final. But what? And would she even survive it? The shadow began to reform, its shape solidifying once again. Lisa knew she had only moments to act, but her body was weak, her mind clouded with exhaustion and fear. "Monica," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know what to do." Monica's hand found hers, her grip surprisingly strong despite her condition. "You'll know," she said, her voice steady. "When the time comes, you'll know." The words gave Lisa a flicker of hope, but the shadow was relentless, and time was running out. Lisa's breaths came in ragged gasps as she fought to keep her focus. The shadow was regrouping, its form rippling with newfound energy as it pressed closer. Every instinct told her to run, but Monica's words echoed in her mind. "You'll know when the time comes." Lisa clenched her fists, forcing herself to stay grounded. She had to trust that somewhere deep inside, the answer was waiting. The shadow hissed, its tendrils lashing out and clawing at the ambulance. The flashing emergency lights had grown weaker, the sirens faltering in and out like a dying heartbeat. Lisa knew she had only moments before the shadow fully consumed them. She grabbed Monica's hand, squeezing it tightly. "Monica, I can't do this without you," Lisa whispered. Monica's eyes fluttered open, her face pale but resolute. She shifted, struggling to sit upright. "You're stronger than you think," she said softly. "But you have to let go of me." Lisa's chest tightened. "I can't. We're in this together." Monica shook her head, a tear slipping down her cheek. "It's me at once, Lisa. If you don't let me go, it'll take both of us, and everyone else." Lisa's mind reeled. The thought of leaving Monica behind was unbearable, but deep down, she knew Monica was right. The shadow's hunger was focused on her, drawn to whatever strange force was now glowing beneath her skin. "No," Lisa said through gritted teeth. "There has to be another way." But Monica's expression told her otherwise. The faint pulsing light in her veins grew brighter, casting a warm glow across the interior of the ambulance. It was as if her very being was fighting back against the darkness, but the effort was draining her fast. The shadow slammed against the vehicle again, the entire structure shuddering under the impact. Lisa's grip on Monica tightened. "If we're going to do this, we do it together," Lisa said firmly. Monica's lips quirked into a faint smile. "You're stubborn, you know that?" Lisa didn't respond, her attention snapping to the shadow as it began pouring into the ambulance in thick, inky waves. The acrid smell was overpowering now, filling her lungs and stinging her eyes. She reached for the emergency flares, her hands shaking as she fumbled to light another one. The flare burst to life, its fiery glow holding the shadow at bay for a moment. But the reprieve was brief. The tendrils snaked around the edges of the light, relentless and unyielding. Lisa realized with a sinking feeling that the flares weren't enough anymore. Monica's glow grew brighter still, illuminating the ambulance like a beacon. The shadow recoiled slightly, its movements hesitant. Lisa's eyes widened as an idea began to form. "It's afraid of you," Lisa whispered. "Your light, it's hurting it." Monica's gaze sharpened. "If that's true, then I know what I have to do." "No," Lisa said quickly, panic surging through her. "You don't have to do this. We'll find another way." But Monica shook her head, her expression resolute. "You said we're in this together, right? Then trust me, Lisa. Trust that this is the only way." Before Lisa could protest further, Monica placed her glowing hand on Lisa's arm. The warmth spread through her like a wave, calming her racing heart. "When it's over," Monica said softly, "you have to warn them. Make sure no one else falls victim to this." Tears blurred Lisa's vision as she nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Monica's light intensified, filling the ambulance with a blinding radiance. The shadow screamed, its tendrils writhing and retreating as the light consumed it. Lisa shielded her eyes, her body trembling as the heat and energy swirled around her. She could feel Monica slipping away, the connection between them growing fainter with each passing second. The shadow's screams grew louder, more desperate, before suddenly cutting off. The silence that followed was deafening, the absence of noise almost as jarring as the chaos that had preceded it. When Lisa opened her eyes, the ambulance was still. The shadow was gone, but so was Monica. All that remained was a faint warmth in the air, a lingering echo of the light that had driven the darkness away. Lisa sat in the silence, her body heavy with exhaustion and grief. The world outside the ambulance was eerily calm, as if the events of the past few hours had been nothing but a nightmare. But the ache in her chest told her it was real. Monica's last words echoed in Lisa's mind, a haunting reminder of the responsibility now resting on her shoulders. She had to warn them, everyone. The shadow wasn't gone for good. It was out there, waiting, and she had to make sure no one else fell into its grasp. As Lisa climbed out of the ambulance, the weight of the task ahead settled over her. The fight wasn't over, it was just beginning. Lisa stumbled as she stepped out of the ambulance, her legs shaky from the ordeal. The cold night air wrapped around her, sharp against the lingering warmth of Monica's light. She glanced back at the ambulance, half expecting to see the shadow reforming, but the interior was empty. Silent. The thought of Monica's sacrifice gnawed at her chest, leaving a hollow ache that felt impossible to fill. The parking lot was unearningly quiet, as though the world itself was holding its breath. The hospital stood in the distance, its windows dark and foreboding. The shadow hadn't reached the building, but Lisa knew it had come too close. She couldn't let its presence fade into the shadows of her memory. She had to act now, before it found another way to spread. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. Monica's words lingered, cryptic and heavy with meaning. Asterisk, it's older than us. It wants everything. Asterisk, Lisa didn't know what it was or where it had come from, but she felt certain of one thing. It wasn't gone. Not entirely. She forced herself to move, each step a battle against the exhaustion weighing her down. Her phone was still in her pocket, miraculously intact. She fumbled to unlock it, her fingers trembling as she dialed 911. The dispatcher's voice crackled on the other end, calm and professional. 911, what's your emergency? Lisa's voice was hoarse as she spoke. There's been an incident. At St. Mary's Hospital parking lot. You need to send help. But she hesitated, unsure how to even begin explaining. It's not just an accident. Something unnatural happened. The dispatcher's tone remained steady, though there was a hint of confusion. Ma'am, are you injured? Can you provide more details? Lisa took a shaky breath, glancing around the empty lot. It's hard to explain, but people are in danger. Something attacked us, something I don't even know how to describe. It's not safe. The dispatcher assured her help was on the way, but Lisa felt a sinking certainty that even the most prepared emergency responders wouldn't know how to deal with this. The shadow wasn't something that could be contained by normal means. As she ended the call, a faint movement in her peripheral vision caught her attention. She whipped around, her heart pounding, but saw nothing. The darkness felt heavier than before, as if the shadow had left a residue in its wake. The air itself seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, making her skin prickle. Lisa's thoughts turned to Monica's final moments. The way her light had pushed back the shadow, even at the cost of her own life. The realization hit her like a wave. Monica had been the key. Whatever had awakened inside her had been powerful enough to fight the darkness, at least temporarily. But now Monica was gone, and Lisa was left to carry the burden of understanding. She replayed Monica's cryptic warnings in her mind, searching for clues. It takes and spreads, always looking for more. If that was true, then it wouldn't stop with Monica. It would find another host, another way to reach into the world and grow stronger. Lisa's gut twisted at the thought. Her attention snapped to the hospital entrance as a pair of headlights pierced the gloom. An ambulance rolled into the lot, followed closely by a squad car. Relief washed over her, but it was tinged with dread. She had to explain what had happened, but how could she make them believe her? How could she convince them that the danger was real? The paramedics climbed out of the ambulance, their expressions cautious but concerned. A police officer approached her, his flashlight cutting through the dim light. Ma'am, are you the one who called 911? Lisa nodded, her throat tight. Yes. But I don't know how to explain. Her voice cracked, and she swallowed hard. Something attacked us. It wasn't human. It wasn't natural. The officer's brow furrowed, skepticism flickering in his eyes. What do you mean? Are you injured? Where's the other person who was with you? Lisa's chest tightened at the mention of Monica. She shook her head, struggling to find the words. She's gone. She sacrificed herself to stop it. But it's not over. Whatever it was, it's still out there. The paramedics exchanged uncertain glances, and the officer's expression hardened. Ma'am, I need you to calm down and start from the beginning. Tell me exactly what happened. Lisa tried to recount the events, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush. She described the strange smell, the yellow stains, the shadow's relentless pursuit. But as she spoke, she could see the doubt in their faces growing. It sounded insane, even to her own ears. The officer sighed, his tone softening slightly. Look, I don't know what you've been through tonight, but maybe we should get you checked out. You've been through a traumatic experience. Lisa clenched her fists, frustration bubbling up. I'm not crazy, she snapped. This isn't just in my head. I saw it. I felt it. The officer held up his hands in a placating gesture. Okay. Let's take it one step at a time. We'll check the area and make sure everything's secure. Lisa knew it was pointless to argue. They couldn't see what she had seen. But as the paramedics guided her toward the second ambulance, she couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow was watching, waiting for its moment to strike again. As Lisa sat on the edge of the ambulance's open rear compartment, her mind raced with unanswered questions. The paramedics were busy checking her vitals, their soft chatter blending into the night's stillness. She could hear the officer speaking into his radio, coordinating a search of the area, but she knew they wouldn't find anything. The shadow was gone, at least for now. Yet, a nagging feeling told her the calm was only temporary. She stared at her hands, the faint glow she had seen earlier now completely absent. She didn't understand what had happened, why Monica had emitted that light, or why the shadow had been so drawn to her. The thought twisted in her stomach like a knot. She wanted answers, but every explanation she could conjure felt like a leap into madness. The officer approached her, his flashlight lowered but still casting a faint glow across the asphalt. We've done a sweep of the area, he said, his tone cautious. There's no sign of this thing you described. No stains, no smell. Just an empty lot. Lisa clenched her jaw, her frustration bubbling up again. It doesn't leave traces like that. It's not something you can find with a flashlight. The officer regarded her carefully, as though weighing whether to press her further. Look, he said finally, we're treating this as a possible incident of trauma. You've been through something, we just don't know what yet. Lisa shook her head, her voice sharp. You don't believe me. None of you do. Before the officer could respond, one of the paramedics interrupted. She's stable, but we should probably get her to the hospital for observation. Just to be safe. Lisa started to protest, but the officer gave her a pointed look. Humor us, ma'am. It's better to be safe. Reluctantly, she climbed into the back of the ambulance. As the doors shut behind her, a chill ran down her spine. The air inside felt thick, almost oppressive, as though the shadow had left behind an invisible residue. She glanced at the paramedic sitting across from her, but he seemed unaware of the subtle change. The ambulance began to move, its engine humming softly as they pulled away from the lot. Lisa stared out the small rear window, watching the flashing lights of the squad car grow smaller in the distance. Her thoughts were a whirlwind, fragments of the night's events flashing through her mind like a broken reel of film. It wasn't until they reached the main road that she noticed something strange. The paramedic across from her, who had been diligently noting her vitals, suddenly froze. His pen hovered midair, his expression vacant. Lisa frowned. Are you okay? He didn't respond. Instead, his head tilted slightly, as if listening to something only he could hear. Then, without warning, he began to hum a low, haunting melody that sent a shiver down Lisa's spine. What are you doing? She asked, her voice tinged with alarm. The paramedic's eyes snapped to hers, and for a moment, she saw something dark and unrecognizable in his gaze. It wasn't just fear or confusion, it was something else. Before she could react, he reached for the radio clipped to his vest, his movements unnaturally stiff. "We have to turn back," he said into the radio, his voice monotone. The driver glanced over his shoulder, clearly confused. "What? Why? She's stable." The paramedic's head jerked toward the driver, his expression eerily blank. "Turn back. Now." Lisa's heart pounded as she pressed herself against the wall of the ambulance. "What's going on?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The driver hesitated, clearly unnerved. "Is everything okay back there?" But before he could get an answer, the paramedic lunged forward, grabbing the steering wheel. The ambulance swerved violently, the tires screeching against the asphalt. Lisa screamed, clutching the side rail as the vehicle careened off the road and skidded to a halt in a patch of gravel. The driver shouted in panic, wrestling the wheel back under control. "What the hell are you doing?" The paramedic didn't answer. He slumped back into his seat, his body limp like a puppet with its strings cut. For a moment, the only sound was Lisa's ragged breathing. Then, slowly, the paramedic's head turned to face her. His lips moved, forming words that didn't match the sound emerging from his throat. "It's not gone," he said, his voice low and distorted. "It's in me." Lisa's blood ran cold. She scrambled to the far end of the ambulance, her mind racing. The glow. The shadow. Monica's sacrifice. Somehow, despite everything, it had found a way back, and now it was inside him. The driver climbed out of the cab, yanking open the rear doors. "What's going on back here?" he demanded, but the moment he saw the paramedic, his face paled. What's wrong with him?" Lisa didn't know how to answer. The paramedic's body was shaking now, his movements jerky and unnatural. The haunting hum began again, louder this time, filling the confined space with an almost unbearable pressure. "We need to get out," Lisa shouted, but before they could move, the paramedic lunged toward the driver, his hands clawing at him with inhuman strength. The driver screamed, stumbling backward and falling to the ground. Lisa grabbed the nearest object, a heavy metal clipboard, and swung it at the paramedic, desperate to stop him. The impact barely fazed him. His head snapped toward her, his eyes black as ink. The hum grew louder, resonating in her chest like a drumbeat. Lisa knew she was out of time. The shadow wasn't just in him, it was spreading. The sound of the officer's body hitting the ground echoed in Lisa's mind as she dragged the driver farther into the darkness. Her breath came in quick, sharp gasps, her heart pounding in her chest. Every step she took felt heavier, as though the very air around her was growing thicker, more suffocating. "Where do we go?" The driver's voice was hoarse, panic evident in every syllable. "What's happening? This isn't real." Lisa shook her head, barely registering his words. She couldn't focus on anything other than getting as far from that ambulance as possible. The shadow, whatever it was relentless. They couldn't afford to stop. Not yet. They stumbled over uneven ground, the dense forest around them blocking out the light from the road. Lisa's mind raced. The paramedic, the officer, it was all connected. This wasn't just a freak accident. Something larger was happening here, something far more sinister. And now, it was coming for them. A distant, unnatural hum reached her ears, drawing her attention. It started faintly, barely perceptible, but it quickly grew louder, more insistent. Lisa's breath hitched in her throat. The shadow wasn't done. It was still coming. "We can't outrun it," she muttered under her breath, her eyes darting around, searching for some kind of escape. The driver looked at her with wide, terrified eyes. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice shaking. Lisa turned toward him, her thoughts scrambling. They had to find somewhere safe. A place to hide, to regroup. The sound of the hum was growing louder, echoing through the trees, a low, vibrating presence that seemed to get closer with every passing second. There was nowhere to run. "We need to find shelter," she said urgently, trying to mask the fear in her voice. "Somewhere, anywhere. We can't just keep running." The driver nodded, his face pale, and they hurried through the underbrush, pushing through the thick trees. The sound of their footsteps was drowned out by the growing hum, which now seemed to vibrate the very ground beneath them. Lisa could feel it in her chest, a deep, pulsating wave of something unnatural. Then, as they rounded a bend in the trail, she saw it. A small, abandoned cabin stood in the clearing, its windows dark and broken, its door hanging off its hinges. Lisa's heart skipped a beat. It was their only chance. She grabbed the driver's arm, pulling him toward the cabin. "Get inside," she ordered, urgency in her voice. They made it to the door, which creaked as Lisa pushed it open, her eyes scanning the interior. The cabin was empty, but the stale air and the decaying furniture gave it an eerie, oppressive feel. It was the perfect place to hide, if they could only make it through the door. The hum had intensified. It was no longer just a sound, it was a force, pressing in on them from all sides. Lisa slammed the door shut behind them and rushed to the window, peeking through the broken glass. Her eyes scanned the clearing outside, but there was no sign of the paramedic. For now, at least, they were safe. "Do you think we lost it?" the driver whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Lisa didn't answer immediately. She had to think. The paramedic, or whatever that thing had become, was no longer human. It was something else, something far darker. And that shadow? It had followed them, and it was growing stronger. It wasn't going to stop until it had consumed everything in its path. She shook her head. "I don't think we're safe." Not yet. The hum was still there, reverberating through the walls of the cabin, as if the shadow itself was waiting outside, biding its time. Lisa moved cautiously through the cabin, searching for anything they could use. A heavy wooden beam lay discarded in a corner, and she grabbed it, feeling its weight in her hands. It was a poor weapon, but it was all she had. The driver paced nervously, his eyes darting around. "What are we going to do? We're stuck here." Lisa's mind raced. She needed more time. Time to think, time to figure out what the hell was happening. But that hum, that constant, bone-chilling hum, it was like a ticking clock, reminding her that their time was running out. Suddenly, the door of the cabin rattled. Lisa froze, the sound of the lock scraping against the wood sending a cold chill down her spine. Someone, was trying to get in. Her heart raced. She held her breath, straining to listen. The shadows outside the cabin seemed to move, as if they were alive, slithering across the ground, creeping toward them. The paramedic wasn't far behind. Whatever that shadow was, it was drawing nearer, ready to finish what it had started. "We can't stay here," Lisa whispered, her voice shaking. She turned to the driver, who was trembling beside her, his eyes wide with terror. "We have to get out. Now." But before they could make another move, the door crashed open with a deafening bang. The driver screamed as a dark, twisted figure lunged into the room. The shadow had found them. The door splintered inwards, and the paramedic, the twisted shell of a man, lunged into the cabin, his body now an eerie, disjointed puppet of shadow and violence. Lisa's pulse hammered in her throat as she raised the wooden beam, her arms trembling with fear and adrenaline. The driver backed into the corner, his hands pressed to his head, muttering incoherently, lost to the terror. The shadow writhed and pulsed, as if it were alive, reacting to the movement of the paramedic's body. Lisa couldn't think. She swung the beam with everything she had, the wood connecting with the paramedic's head with a sickening crack. But the blow didn't stop him. It didn't even slow him down. Instead, the shadow seemed to absorb the impact, as if it were feeding off the violence. The paramedic's eyes, now a deep, soulless black, met hers with an expression of cold emptiness. His lips twitched into something that might have been a smile, but it was devoid of humanity. The air was thick with the hum, louder now, vibrating the very walls of the cabin. Lisa's throat tightened, and she struggled to breathe. The thing inside the paramedic wasn't just some rogue entity, it was something ancient, something that thrived on fear, on chaos. "Get away from him," she shouted, the words coming out more as a plea than a command. Her eyes flicked to the driver, who was frozen in place, unable to move. Then, as if in answer to her desperation, something changed. The hum stopped. A chilling silence fell over the cabin, oppressive and thick. Lisa's breath caught in her throat as the paramedic paused, his head tilting to the side as if listening to something unseen. The shadow that had consumed him seemed to ebb and flow, no longer as frenzied, as if it were waiting for something. And then, in the eerie stillness, Lisa felt it. A shift in the air. A subtle movement, almost imperceptible, but enough to make the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. The paramedic didn't move. He just stood there, his dark eyes locked onto hers, as though waiting for her to understand. And that's when it hit her, the shadow wasn't just some parasitic force. It was feeding off something far deeper than fear. It was controlling the very essence of those it touched, drawing strength from their connection to it. "No," Lisa whispered, realization creeping over her like a cold hand. She turned to the driver, who was still trembling in the corner, unable to process what was happening. The driver looked up, confused. "What is it? What's happening?" Before Lisa could respond, a voice filled the cabin. It wasn't the voice of the paramedic, it was distorted, otherworldly, as if the very air itself had spoken. "You cannot escape," the voice said. "You are already part of me." Lisa's blood ran cold. The voice wasn't coming from the paramedic anymore. It was coming from everywhere. It was inside her head, inside the walls of the cabin. It was in the very foundation of the world around them. She turned back to the paramedic, but it wasn't the man she remembered anymore. It was something worse, something entirely different. The shadow that had consumed him began to shift and twist, the inky blackness spreading across the room like a living thing, creeping along the walls, over the floor, reaching for them. The driver screamed, and it was the last thing Lisa heard before everything went dark. When she opened her eyes again, she was no longer in the cabin. She was standing on the edge of a vast, empty landscape, a dark, desolate plain that stretched out into nothingness. The ground beneath her was cracked and barren, the air thick with an oppressive silence. And there, standing at the horizon, was the paramedic, if he could still be called that. His body was no longer recognizable, just a shadow of twisted, dark forms. And behind him, the thing, if it could be called that, loomed, larger than anything Lisa had ever seen. A formless mass, a dark cloud that seemed to swallow up everything in its path, devouring the light and the air. Lisa's mind reeled as she took a step forward, unsure if her body was moving on its own or if the force around her was dragging her. The shadow stretched toward her, and her heart raced, but she didn't run. She couldn't. It was too late for that. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something, a flicker, a glimmer of light. The driver. He was standing beside her, his face pale but determined. "This is it," he whispered. "This is how it ends." "No," Lisa said, shaking her head. "We can't let it end like this." She reached out, but her fingers didn't touch the ground. Instead, she felt something pull her forward, as if the very fabric of reality was bending, reshaping. And then, as if in answer to her resolve, the world shifted again. The shadow screeched, a sound that rattled her bones. The dark mass that loomed behind the paramedic began to fracture, breaking apart into thousands of tiny, twisting tendrils that reached for her. Lisa felt her body pulled backward, but she fought it, her hands gripping the air as though it were solid. The light, the flicker she had seen, was getting brighter, more intense. Just as the tendrils wrapped around her, pulling her into the darkness, she screamed. But the scream was swallowed by the light. And then, everything stopped. Lisa was back in the cabin. The paramedic, the driver, gone. The air was still, and the hum had faded into nothingness. The room was eerily quiet, too quiet, as if nothing had ever happened. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, unsure if she was still alive, unsure of what had just happened. And then, from the corner of the room, a shadow began to form again, rising up like a dark wave. And this time, Lisa knew, the nightmare was far from over. Lisa's heart raced as she took a hesitant step back, her eyes wide in disbelief. The shadow began to take shape again, the same inky blackness swirling in the corner of the cabin. It writhed like a living thing, as though it could sense her fear, feeding off it. The air grew thick, and the oppressive feeling of being trapped returned, suffocating her. She turned to the driver, who was standing beside her now, his face pale and drawn. His hands shook, but there was something different in his eyes. A strange, dark resolve that Lisa couldn't quite place. The tension between them was palpable, as if they both knew the same truth but couldn't bring themselves to say it. What is it?" Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible. The words felt foreign on her tongue, as if they didn't belong to her anymore. The driver's eyes flicked to the corner where the shadow was now fully formed, its shape more pronounced than ever. "It's not over," he muttered, barely above a whisper. "It never was." Lisa's mind raced. She remembered the strange, distorted voice, the warning that they couldn't escape, that they were already part of it. The shadow had been feeding on them, on their fear, on their confusion. But it wasn't just after their bodies anymore. It was after something far deeper, something that couldn't be touched by any weapon or force. "We have to stop it," Lisa said, her voice shaking but growing firmer. "We have to stop it before it takes everything." The driver didn't answer immediately. He seemed lost in his own thoughts, his eyes staring at the ground as though contemplating something heavy. But then, his gaze lifted to meet hers, and for a brief moment, she saw something flicker in his expression, something dark, almost knowing. "I don't think we can," he said quietly. The words hit Lisa like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean?" she demanded, her voice rising. "We can't just give up." But the driver didn't respond. Instead, he turned slowly, his eyes locking onto the shadow that now stretched across the room. It seemed to pulse with an unnatural life, the dark tendrils shifting and twisting like serpents, reaching out toward them. Lisa followed his gaze and saw it. The shadow wasn't just alive, it was evolving. It was no longer contained, no longer tethered to the paramedic. It was becoming something more, a force that defied all logic, a presence that reached beyond the physical world. Suddenly, the shadow recoiled, as if sensing something. Lisa felt it too, a deep, gnawing pressure that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the cabin, pressing in on her from all sides. The hum was gone, replaced by a low, vibrating growl, like a distant thunderstorm building in intensity. And then, she saw it. The shape of the paramedic, his body twisted and contorted, his movements unnatural, his features barely recognizable, stepped out from the shadow. His eyes were black, completely void of any humanity, just like before. But this time, he was different. His form seemed almost insubstantial, like he was no longer bound by flesh, no longer a man at all. Lisa's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know how, but she knew this wasn't just the shadow anymore. It had taken something else, something that made it even more dangerous. The paramedic wasn't just its vessel, he had become part of it. And now, the thing, whatever it was, had control over him completely. I can't move," Lisa muttered, her voice trembling. The weight of the shadow pressed in on her chest, and she felt her legs give way beneath her, her body trembling uncontrollably. She reached out, grasping for anything that could anchor her to reality, but there was nothing. The air itself seemed to be closing in. The driver stood frozen, his face pale and sweat beading on his forehead. He glanced around wildly, his eyes darting from the paramedic to the dark mass in the corner. This is it," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. "It's not just after us. It's after everything." Lisa's mind struggled to process the gravity of his words. What did he mean? Everything? She felt the shadow stretch toward her, its cold tendrils brushing against her skin, and she realized she was the one it was after now. "Get back," the driver suddenly shouted, his voice breaking the tension. "We have to stop it, now." But Lisa couldn't move. The shadow had her in its grip, and it wasn't letting go. Her body felt numb, her thoughts fragmented. She tried to scream, but the words died in her throat. Then, from the corner of the room, there was a sound, a low, mournful cry. It echoed through the cabin, reverberating in her bones, and for a moment, she thought she saw something flicker in the shadow. Something familiar. It was a face. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. The face was distorted, twisted in agony, but it was unmistakable. It was the paramedic, but not the one she had seen earlier. This was the man who had stepped out of the ambulance, the one who had been swallowed by the darkness. This was the real paramedic, the person who had been consumed by the shadow long before Lisa had even stepped foot in the cabin. His mouth opened, and the sound that came out wasn't his voice, it was something else entirely. It was a voice from the depths of the shadow, a voice that seemed to speak directly to Lisa's soul. "You should have never come here," the voice hissed. "Now, you are mine." The words hit her like a punch, and the cabin seemed to close in around her. She tried to fight back, tried to force her legs to move, but the shadow tightened its grip, drawing her closer, pulling her into its abyss. And then, just as Lisa thought she couldn't take any more, something shifted. There was a light, a soft glow, faint at first, but growing brighter. It wasn't a flash, wasn't some sudden burst of power. It was a steady, almost comforting presence. The paramedic's body jerked violently, as though fighting against the shadow that had taken over. His eyes flickered with a brief moment of recognition, and Lisa felt it, a sliver of hope, however small. It wasn't over. It couldn't be. The light grew, spreading through the cabin like a tidal wave, pushing against the darkness, forcing it back. The paramedic's form convulsed, his body writhing as the shadow seemed to recoil, like a beast driven back into its lair. And then, in the blink of an eye, the shadow was gone. The cabin was still. The air was thick with silence, and Lisa was left standing in the middle of it all, her body trembling but her heart pounding with a strange sense of victory. The driver stood beside her, equally silent, his eyes wide with shock. But just as Lisa thought the nightmare had ended, she saw something in the corner of her eye, a shadow, creeping across the floor, slowly crawling toward her once again. It wasn't over. It had only just begun. Lisa's heart raced again as she watched the shadow slither across the floor, its shape twisting unnaturally. For a moment, everything went still, as though the very air had held its breath. But this time, she wasn't paralyzed by fear. She could feel the presence of the darkness, but she also felt something else, a sense of defiance rising from deep within her. The driver, too, seemed to sense the change. He stepped forward, his hand trembling as he reached for the emergency flashlight they had left behind. His eyes were fixed on the shadow, but there was no longer fear in them. Instead, there was resolve. He wasn't going to let it claim them. Not now, not after everything they had been through. Lisa felt the weight of the moment, the urgency that had become familiar in these last, terrifying hours. The shadow had been defeated once, but now it was regrouping, trying to reclaim its hold. They couldn't let it. Not when they had fought so hard. "You can't hide from me forever," Lisa whispered, more to herself than the shadow. The words felt strange, powerful, as if they were a weapon she could wield against the darkness. The driver turned to her, his expression unreadable but determined. "We don't have time to think. We need to end this." Lisa nodded, her eyes never leaving the creeping darkness. They both knew there was only one way to stop it for good. The light, the glow that had saved them before, was the key. They had to find it, harness it. They had to bring it into the heart of the shadow, and let it burn away the darkness once and for all. With shaking hands, the driver activated the flashlight, its beam cutting through the murk like a knife. The light felt warm, almost alive, as it danced in the darkness. Lisa felt her pulse quicken, the sensation of power growing with each passing second. The shadow recoiled as the light pressed forward, its edges quivering and retreating, as though it could sense the imminent threat. The driver moved toward the center of the room, keeping the light trained on the shadow, pushing it back with every step. Lisa joined him, standing at his side. They had come this far. They couldn't let it end now. With one final, unified push, the driver swung the flashlight toward the heart of the shadow. The light flared, brilliant and blinding, consuming the darkness in its glow. The shadow screamed, a deafening, unnatural sound that filled every corner of the room, reverberating through Lisa's very bones. She shielded her eyes, unable to look directly at the intensity of the light, but she could feel the heat, the power surging from it. For a long moment, the room was filled with nothing but the burning light, and then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow was gone. The silence that followed was heavy. The air felt different, cleaner, freer, as though something had been lifted. Lisa lowered her hand from her eyes, squinting against the residual brightness. The cabin was empty now, save for her and the driver. The paramedic was gone, the shadow gone, and the suffocating grip that had held them was broken. It was over. Finally. Lisa let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Her body sagged with exhaustion, but a strange sense of relief washed over her. They had done it. They had stopped it. The darkness had been defeated, driven away by the light they had summoned together. The driver collapsed to his knees, his hands shaking as he dropped the flashlight. He was panting, his face drenched with sweat, but there was a smile on his lips. It wasn't one of joy, not exactly. It was the smile of someone who had just survived the impossible. "We made it," he said softly, his voice hoarse. "We really made it." Lisa nodded, unable to speak at first. She had seen things she couldn't explain, faced horrors she would never forget, but in that moment, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in a long time. It was a bittersweet feeling, knowing that they had made it out alive, but also that so much had been lost along the way. She looked around the cabin, her eyes scanning the empty space. It was over. But the memories would remain, etched into her mind forever. The strange darkness, the shadow that had tried to consume them, was gone, but it had left its mark. And Lisa knew that, even though they had won, they were forever changed. "We should leave," Lisa said, her voice steadier now. "We need to get out of here. The authorities will be looking for us." The driver nodded, pushing himself to his feet. He seemed reluctant to leave, as if he were still processing everything that had happened. But he knew, just as Lisa did, that there was no point in staying. The shadow was gone, and there was nothing left for them here. Together, they stepped outside into the quiet night, the first rays of dawn creeping over the horizon. The world was still, as if it had been holding its breath, waiting for this moment to come. Lisa felt the cool air against her skin, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe again. As they walked away from the cabin, Lisa took one last glance back. The shadow was gone, but there was still something lingering in the air, a faint whisper that seemed to echo from the depths of her mind. It was a reminder, a warning. Something they had faced, something they had barely survived. And even though the shadow was defeated, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, waiting, watching. But for now, they were free. They walked toward the nearest road, their footsteps light against the gravel, their minds still racing with the weight of everything they had been through. And as they moved forward, Lisa couldn't help but wonder, would they ever truly be free? Or was the shadow, in some form, always waiting to return? For now, though, she would let herself believe that it was over. They had faced the darkness and survived. That, at least, was enough. The end.